Arizona Territory, 1883. The heat clung to the dirt like a second skin, and the wind dragged dust through the streets of Dry Creek like it had a score to settle. Harlan Kingsley stepped out from the livery stable, wiping sweat and grime from his brow with the back of his hand. He had just finished replacing a wagon wheel for a rancher passing through, and was thinking about heading to the saloon for something cold to drink before sundown. The streets were quiet, just the distant clatter of hooves and the low murmur of voices behind swinging doors. He rounded the side of the saloon, cutting through the narrow alley where the kitchen tossed out scraps, and stopped dead in his tracks. A woman was crouched behind the saloon, her fingers wrapped around half a biscuit she had pulled from the slop bucket. Her dress was torn at the hem, stained with dust and old blood. Her boots barely held together. Her hair hung in clumps, sun-bleached and tangled, but her eyes, sharp, blue, and defiant, met his like she was daring him to speak. She looked about 20, maybe a year or two older. Thin, but not weak. Not the way she held herself. "What the hell are you doing?" Harlan asked, voice low, not harsh. She didn't flinch. She just stood, slow and deliberate, brushing crumbs from her fingers. "Eating, behind a saloon, out of trash, better than starving." Harlan stared at her. Something about the way she looked at him, like she had nothing left to lose, caught hard in his chest. She wasn't begging. She wasn't crying. She was just surviving. "You got a name?" he asked. "Blythe Emery." He stepped forward, eyes still on hers. "You'll eat at my table from now on, Blythe." She blinked, confused by how certain he sounded. "I don't need saving," she said. "I'm not offering that," he replied. "I'm offering supper, that's all." A long silence stretched between them. Then finally she nodded once. They walked across the dusty street to his place, a modest two-room house near the edge of town, with a corral behind and a vegetable patch barely hanging on in the dry soil. He opened the door, let her step inside first. She scanned the room like she did not trust it, like she expected someone to jump from the shadows. "Sit," Harlan said, nodding toward the table. She sat. He went to the stove, ladled out the last of the stew he had made the night before. It was mostly beans and carrots, but it was hot and filling. He set the bowl in front of her with a slice of bread. She stared at it for a long second, then picked up the spoon and ate like she had not had a real meal in weeks. "You from around here?" he asked. "No, running from something," she paused, then said, "running from everything." He did not push. Instead, he sat across from her and watched her eat, slow and steady, like someone who had forgotten the taste of food. She finished and set the spoon down gently, then leaned back. "I'll work," she said. "I do not take charity." "I do not give it," Harlan said, "but I could use help around here. Chores, cooking if you can," she nodded. "I can." That night she slept in the bed. He took the cot by the stove. She tried to argue, but he did not listen. The next morning she was already tending the chickens when he stepped outside. She looked different in the sunlight, less ghost, more girl. Her sleeves were rolled up, her hands dirty, her hair tied back with a strip of cloth. "You sleep?" he asked. "Some." He handed her a tin cup of coffee. She took it, their fingers brushed, and for a second she did not pull away. Over the next few days she learned his routines and he learned hers. She never asked for anything, but she worked hard. She patched his shirts with thread she found in a drawer. She boiled water when his back ached. She fed the horses without being asked. He never asked what had happened to her, but one night as the sun bled out behind the hills, she spoke. "My father died in Kansas. Fever. Mother followed a month later. I came west with a man who promised work. He left me in Tucson with nothing but a bad name and a broken promise." Harlan's jaw tightened. Men like that ought to be dragged behind their own horses. She smiled, a tired, crooked thing. "He took everything." "You still have your name," Harlan said. "You still have your hands. And you still have a place here." She looked at him for a long while, something shifting behind her eyes. The days rolled on. She laughed one morning when he tripped over a bucket. Later, she made him stew with wild onion and rabbit. He found himself watching her more, the curve of her smile, the way she swept hair from her face. She was not just surviving anymore. She was living again. One night after supper, they sat on the porch. The air was warm, crickets humming low. She leaned her head on his shoulder and he did not move. "You never asked me why I was back there," she said. "I figured you would tell me if you wanted to." I was hungry. I thought I could handle it. I always could before. Her voice cracked just a little. But this time I could not. You do not have to anymore, Blythe. She turned her face toward him. Why are you doing this? You do not even know me. I know enough, he said. I know you are stronger than most men I have met. I know you work hard. And I know I feel better when you are near. Her breath caught. I never expected to feel anything for anyone again, she said. Me neither. He reached for her hand. She let him. That night she did not go to the bed alone, and he did not stay on the cot. They did not speak much as they lay there, but her hand found his under the blanket, and she did not let go. And Harlan Kingsley, who had lived alone for 5 long years, felt his heart settle for the first time in just as long. Blythe Emery, who had been thrown away by everyone she had ever known, finally felt chosen. The morning sun cast long shadows through the kitchen window as Blythe scrubbed the last of the breakfast plates. A breeze stirred the thin curtain, lifting the scent of soap and sun-warmed wood. Outside, the hammering of Harlan's mallet echoed from the shed. He was rebuilding the chicken coop roof, after a windstorm 2 nights back had torn through half the planks. Blythe dried her hands on her skirt and stepped out barefoot onto the porch. The air smelled of mesquite and horses, and somewhere out past the ridge, a hawk cried once sharp and high. She crossed the yard to where Harlan stood on a ladder, shirt sleeves pushed to his elbows, sweat glinting on the back of his neck. You missed breakfast, she said, folding her arms. He glanced down at her. I figured I'd earn it first. You always say that, doesn't make it true. He gave a faint chuckle and tapped a nail into place. There's bread left, half a loaf and what's left of the eggs. I saved some coffee, too. She hesitated, then added, you should eat before it goes cold. He climbed down, wiping his hands on a rag. She walked beside him back to the house, not speaking. It wasn't silence filled with distance, just the kind that settled easy between people who didn't need to fill it. Inside, he poured the coffee and sat while she cut the bread. She didn't sit right away, just leaned against the counter watching him. You ever think about leaving Dry Creek? She asked. He looked up from his cup. Once or twice. What stopped you? He set the cup down. Didn't see the point. I've got what I need here. Good land. My own roof. No one looking down their nose at me. Her gaze didn't waver. No one asking you to start over either. Is that what you're thinking? Starting over? I don't know yet. She peeled a splinter from the countertop, eyes fixed on it. But I know I can't go back. You're not going back, he said, quiet but firm. That night, she pulled out a length of calico from the trunk near the hearth. It was faded but whole. She cut careful strips by the firelight, then threaded a needle. Harlan sat nearby, sharpening his pocket knife on a whetstone, glancing at her now and then. You always sew in silence, he asked after a while. She didn't look up. Not always. Sometimes there's just nothing to say. He tested the blade with his thumb and set it aside. What are you making? A curtain for the back window. It's bare. I hadn't noticed. I had. She tied off the thread and reached for another strip. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. You ever live in a place longer than a season? She paused, then nodded. When I was 17, I stayed with a preacher's family near Emporia, 3 months. They had 7 children. The youngest followed me around like a shadow. What happened? They moved on. Oklahoma land rush, left me behind when they couldn't feed another mouth. Harlan didn't answer right away. The fire cracked softly between them. You like it here? He asked finally. She set her sewing down. I do. You thinking about staying? I'm thinking about planting beets in that far corner by the fence. Soil's softer there. He smiled, slow and genuine. Then I'll clear the rocks out for you. She stood, knees stiff from sitting, and walked over to the hearth. He watched her hands as she stirred the embers, the way her fingers moved with quiet purpose. I never had my own patch of earth, she said, almost to herself. Not really, always borrowed or stolen or taken back. You've got it now, she turned. Do I? His voice stayed steady, but something in it shifted. You do, Blythe. You've got it for good. She looked at him for a long moment, then crossed the room and placed a hand on his chest. You always say things like you mean them. Because I do. He covered her hand with his own, and neither of them moved for a long while. Later, when the fire had burned low and the house had gone quiet except for the ticking of the mantel clock, Harlan stood behind her at the window while she hung the curtain she had finished. It's crooked, she said, stepping back. He tilted his head. I like it that way, she laughed, soft and surprised. You would. He slid his arm around her waist and rested his chin on her shoulder. She leaned into him without hesitation. Outside, the wind rattled the bare branches of the cottonwood. Inside, they stood together, watching the fabric flutter slightly in the night air, and said nothing more. The first rain in weeks came just after dusk, soft and steady, tapping against the roof like a slow breath. Inside, the scent of wet earth drifted in through the open window, mingling with the iron tang of the skillet where Blythe was frying cornmeal cakes. Harlan sat by the hearth, mending a halter strap, his boots off and his shirt hung to dry near the stove. You ever ride north? She asked, flipping the last cake onto a tin plate. Only as far as Prescott, traded a mule for a wagon axle once, froze half the way back. She brought the plate over and set it between them on the table. They say the hills up there turn gold when the aspens change. I reckon that's true. Never stayed long enough to see it. She tore a cake in half, steam curling up from the center. If you had no land to mind, where would you go? He thought a long moment. Some place with trees thick enough to block the wind. Maybe a river close by, not far from a rail line, but not so close you hear it at night. You ever think about selling this place? No, he said, then added, not unless I had reason. She didn't press. They ate in quiet, listening to the stove tick as it cooled. Later, she lit the oil lamp and sat at the table with a worn ledger book she'd found in the trunk beneath the bed. She dipped the quill carefully and began writing in small, deliberate script. What's that? He asked, glancing up from the halter. A list, she said, of what's planted, what's stored, what we still need come winter. You're planning that far ahead now. She didn't look up. I don't plan to leave before then. He set the halter down. You could have gone. That first week when I was off fixing fence. You had time. I know. He crossed the room, stood behind her chair. Why didn't you? She turned the page slowly. Because this is the first place I've ever felt like I belonged without having to prove it. He leaned down, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. You don't have to prove anything to me. Not ever. Her eyes stayed on the page, but her fingers reached up, covered his. I want to do more than just stay, she said. I want to make something here, something that lasts. You already have. His voice was quiet but sure. The rain tapped louder now, steady against the windows. She closed the ledger, her fingers lingering on the cover. He didn't move as she stood and turned to face him. Her expression held no uncertainty, only a quiet resolve that hadn't been there before. I want to build a smokehouse, she said. Drying racks too. That slope behind the corral gets good sun. I'll help you mark it out in the morning, he said. They stood close, the kind of close that didn't need touching to feel full. She reached for his hand and he let her take it. I used to think I'd never trust a man again, she said, but you never asked me to, you just waited. I wasn't waiting, he said. I was hoping. Outside, the rain began to lighten, the sound softening into the hush of soaked ground drinking deep. She stepped into him then, slow and certain, her hand rising to his cheek. I want to be yours, she said, not out of gratitude, not out of need. Just because I want to be. He rested his forehead against hers. Then be mine. They kissed slow and steady like the rain outside, like the promise of something rooted and growing, not rushed, not uncertain, just real. That night they lay in the dark, her back to his chest, his arm curved around her waist. The air smelled of wet sage and warm skin. Neither of them spoke. There was no need. In the morning, he woke to find her already outside, marking the earth with a stick, measuring paces with bare feet, her braids swinging behind her. Harlan stepped out with a mug of coffee and watched her for a while. She looked up, shielding her eyes from the low sun. We'll need stone, she said. And hickory if we can get it. I'll ride out to Mackin's place. He's got scraps he'll trade. She nodded, then smiled, not the cautious kind she'd worn when she first came, but something open, easy. He handed her the mug. She took a sip, then passed it back. They stood there a moment longer, side by side in the morning light. Two people who had nothing left to run from and nothing more to prove, only a life ahead, waiting to be built. Together. By late August, the air grew thicker with heat, and the mesquite along the edge of the pasture dropped their seed pods in brittle clusters. Coyotes called farther off now. keeping their distance from the corral where Harlan's rifle leaned just inside the barn door. The smokehouse stood half-finished, its stone base curing under a canvas tarp while they waited on more lime to seal the corners. Blythe spent more time near the ledger these days, filling columns with neat rows of figures and sketches of the garden rows she planned for spring. Her handwriting had steadied over time, and she now wrote with the kind of certainty that only came from being counted on. That afternoon, she knelt in the patch near the fence with a length of canvas spread out beneath her. She sorted through the last of the seed sacks they'd traded from Macken's wife okra, marrow beans, and a small pouch of tobacco she hadn't asked for but took anyway. Harlan approached, the rolled map of the grazing boundary slung under one arm. "You think we could fence the west slope by winter?" he asked, crouching beside her. "If the posts hold," she said. "Soil's looser toward the ridge, you'll have to dig deeper." "You'll help," she gave a small nod. "I can dig." He unrolled the map and pressed it flat with a calloused hand. "I marked where the spring breaks off. Could be a well site. You want to stay here long enough to need another well. I want to stay here long enough to need 3. She looked up at him. "That a promise? It's a want." "I'd like it to be a promise." She studied the map, then reached forward and drew a faint line just east of the corral. "That's where I want the orchard." He didn't question it. The next morning, they rode together out past the canyon's edge, where the land turned red and brittle and the air smelled of creosote. They were after limestone and clay, and Harlan knew of a dry wash where the old miners had stripped the walls decades back. Blythe rode the mule, reins easy in her hands, her eyes scanning the rock like she could see beneath it. They didn't speak much on the ride, but when they found the vein, she dismounted and ran her fingers along the stone. "This'll do," she said. "It's clean. You see everything like that?" Harlan asked, swinging down beside her. "Only the things I want to fix." They loaded what they could into the wagon, rough chunks wrapped in sacking to keep the dust down. Blythe packed them tight, knees braced, arms steady. Harlan watched her work and thought how nothing in his life had ever held quite this kind of weight before. That night, she sat on the porch with a small sheet of paper folded in her lap. She didn't unfold it until he joined her. "I wrote to the postmaster in Emporia," she said. "Asked if they knew what happened to the youngest Downs boy. The one you mentioned, followed you around. He'd be 13 now, maybe 14. I just wanted to know. You think they'll answer? Maybe. I didn't use my name." He didn't ask what name she used instead. She unfolded the paper once, then folded it again, slow and careful. "I want to marry you," he said, voice even. She didn't react right away. "You asking?" He turned slightly in his chair to face her. "I'm saying it plain. I want to be your husband. I want you to have this land as much as I do. I want your name beside mine on every page we write from here on." She looked out toward the hills, where the last of the purple light was slipping away. "You're not afraid I'll leave?" "I don't have to be." After a long moment, she turned to him. "Then yes." He reached for her hand, and she let him lace his fingers through hers. She slept in his arms that night, her head tucked beneath his chin, the paper tucked safely in the drawer beside the bed. Neither of them dreamed. They didn't need to. The future was already taking shape, one stone, one seed, one promise at a time. The church stood on the high end of Dry Creek, set back from the sun-hardened trail and shaded by 2 half-dead cottonwoods that had clung to life longer than most men in town. It had no bell tower, just a sloped roof and windows too narrow for light to properly fill the pews. But the preacher was honest, and the floorboards didn't creak too loud when you walked the aisle. Blythe wore a dress she'd made from deep blue calico, simple and unadorned, the sleeves hemmed with a stitch she'd taught herself in Kansas. Harlan had borrowed a coat from the undertaker, who rarely needed it in summer. They'd walked to the church on foot, hand in hand, the townsfolk watching quietly from porches and storefronts, not gawking, just noticing. Inside, the pews held only a few familiar faces: Macken and his wife, the young schoolmarm from the edge of town, and the blacksmith who'd once offered to trade a saddle for a sack of potatoes, and now nodded once as Blythe passed him. The preacher spoke his piece, spare and without flourish. No one stirred while Harlan took Blythe's hand and said, "I will keep you in all seasons." She replied, "And I will stand beside you come hunger or harvest." They kissed once, short and sure, and it was done. Back at the homestead, Macken's wife left a pie on their steps without knocking. The schoolmarm brought a jar of pickled peaches. Blythe set them both on the table without a word, then pulled off her boots and stood barefoot on the kitchen floor, looking out through the window where the orchard stakes waited, driven deep into the soil. Harlan came in behind her, resting his chin on her shoulder. "You could have had more," he said. "A big wedding, music, lace." "I had enough," she said. "I had the truth of it." They didn't celebrate loud. They ate cornbread and beans, and after the sun dipped low, they sat on the porch and watched a skunk nose through the garden fence before it gave up and wandered off toward the creek. Later, they lay in bed with the windows open, the air thick with late summer heat. Harlan ran his thumb down the inside of Blythe's wrist and said, "You were never meant to be left behind." She whispered back, "I wasn't meant to be found either, but you did." September came with cooler winds and the first signs of frost on the ridge. The orchard took root slow but steady, 6 young saplings, spaced even, the soil packed and watered with care. Harlan hauled stones from the dry wash to ring their bases, while Blythe stitched cloth wraps for the trunks to guard against the cold. One morning, as the sun slipped over the horizon pale and low, Blythe stood at the edge of the field and pointed toward something in the dirt. "Tracks," she said. "Deer. Too narrow. Maybe a stray dog." They followed the prints past the fence line, where they found a cane basket half buried in brush. Inside, wrapped in a worn blanket, was a baby girl, no more than a few weeks old, her face blotched with cold and her fists curled tight. Blythe knelt without hesitation, lifting the child into her arms. "She's been out here all night. No note. Nothing." Harlan took off his coat and wrapped it around them both. "We'll take her in." He didn't ask twice. They brought her home, warmed goat's milk on the stove, boiled linens, and laid her in a basin lined with soft cloth. Blythe rocked her long into the night, humming low, a tune she hadn't heard since her mother's voice still filled the air of her childhood home. 2 days later, the sheriff rode out. He'd heard about the child from a peddler passing through. No one had come forward to claim her. He nodded once at the porch and said, "If you want to keep her, there's no one standing in the way." They named her Clara. By October, Clara smiled when Blythe sang and quieted when Harlan carried her out to the barn in the early morning. They built a cradle from scrap pine and set it beside their bed. The smokehouse stood finished, cured and ready, and the orchard leaves had turned the color of rust and fire. One evening, as Harlan carved a horse from a block of wood and Blythe stirred kettle soap over the fire, she said, "I never thought I'd live a life so full." He set the carving down and came to her, resting a hand at the small of her back. "We've still got a long way to go." "I know," she said. "But it's ours." They grew together in the quiet, not needing more than what they had. Work came with dawn, rest with dusk, and love steady between. Years passed. The orchard bore fruit. Clara learned to walk between the garden rows. Folks in Dry Creek stopped calling Blythe, that woman who showed up with nothing, and started calling her Mrs. Kingsley. She taught Clara how to plant carrots and mend seams. Harlan taught her to ride and read the stars. They grew old together, not quick, but slow like trees rooted deep, bending with the wind, never breaking. And in that place, at the edge of the Arizona hills, where the soil held every hope they ever laid down, they lived out the years with hands still clasped, hearts still steady, and nothing left undone.